how such an impeachment would play out and the extent to which Republicans would join the effort. We're also going to tackle the question of why this happened. Numerous forces led to the insurrection on Wednesday: President Trump's incitement, election conspiracy theories promoted by many Republicans, white nationalism, unprepared law enforcement, and more. So in the second half of the show, we're going to speak with various writers at 538 who have looked into those forces. But here with me to kick off the show and discuss the political and legal repercussions for the president are senior politics writer Perry Bacon Jr. Hey, Perry.
Hi, Galen.
Also here with us is senior writer and legal analyst Amelia Thompson DeVoe. Hey, Amelia.
Hey, Galen.
And Nate is out this week. So as I mentioned, House Democrats are introducing a resolution today, Monday, asking Vice President Mike Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment. And then if he doesn't within 24 hours, the Democrats are planning to introduce articles of impeachment or vote on those articles. So, Perry, kick us off here. Why have Democrats chosen to go this route? It's Monday. It has been 5 days since this insurrection. There has been a bunch of conversations within the Democratic Party and amongst a few Republicans about how to move forward. How did they settle on this plan that I've described here?
The short answer is that the 25th Amendment did not, Pelosi was hoping that Mike Pence did the 25th Amendment himself. That did not happen. So that was one thing. And it seems like right now, at least, it's hard to imagine that a lot of Republicans in the House are going to support impeachment. More importantly, a lot of Republicans in the Senate are probably not going to support impeachment either. So we're now at a point where it looks like the impeachment votes are going to be symbolic and a criticism of the president, but it's unlikely he's going to be pushed out of office. I think the last few days suggest neither the cabinet nor the Senate Republicans are going to actually support removing Trump from office. So now we're having votes that are basically the Democrats themselves are to some extent saying, we are mad, we think Trump has done bad things. But it looks like these votes are not going to have the action of actually getting him out of office, which I would argue is an imminent threat. The way he's behaved, leaving him in office is an imminent threat, but the votes are not there. And I do think it's worth noting that it looks like Pelosi in some ways, the action happened on Wednesday. We're going to have an impeachment vote basically the next Wednesday, a week later. If this is a real urgency, she could have pushed forward. And in my view, this is another instance of Pelosi sort of wanting to get the Republicans to take on Trump as opposed to doing it herself, which we saw a lot of over these last 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, if it seems pretty clear that Mike Pence wouldn't invoke the 25th Amendment, and there are various arguments for why he should or shouldn't, based in why the 25th Amendment was created to begin with. Why are they even taking this route of waiting the 24 hours with this resolution? Why not just jump to impeachment today?
That's what I'm saying is I'm not sure the point, this resolution today and tomorrow to get Mike Pence to do something he's clearly not going to do feels like a fruitless sort of waste of time. And I'm not sure there's any real good procedural arguments for this beyond they want to get Republicans on the record and they want to embarrass and shame Mike Pence more and the cabinet more. The political benefit of the Democrats is the Republicans are going to end up taking a pro-Trump vote 3 times. They're objecting to the resolution on Monday. They're going to object to it again on Tuesday. They're going to end up voting against impeachment. So you've shamed the Republicans more, I guess, if you're Pelosi. But I think for the American people, the concern is not do the Republicans cast 3 votes that make them look bad, but is a dangerous president moved out of office? It looks like, and this resolution process seems to do nothing but have more political votes going on.
Amelia, what is the point of the 25th Amendment that we've discussed so much at this point?
I think this is one of the complicating features of this whole debate is that it's not really clear, and I think you can make a pretty good argument that this is not really what the 25th Amendment was intended for. Basically, the goal of the 25th Amendment is to create a mechanism for the vice president to take over if a president is incapacitated due to disability. And a helpful example of this might be the 25th Amendment was passed in the 1960s. And let's say that when JFK was shot, that he hadn't died, he was in, some sort of incapacitated state and couldn't actively pass on power to the vice president. And so the concern is, okay, we want to make sure that if there's a situation, God forbid, that the president is really incapacitated, and also incapacitated to the point where they are unable to actually pass power onto the vice president, that there's a mechanism for doing that. It's not really clear, and I've talked to some legal analysts and read some reports indicating that it wasn't intended to deal with a president who is not necessarily incapacitated, is just dangerous, failing in various ways in his role as president. So, I understand the political appeal of the 25th Amendment for someone like Pelosi, and certainly from the Democrats' perspective, and also just from the political realities of what's happening with impeachment now that Perry was just laying out, it would certainly be much neater for the Democrats if they could get Trump's own administration to be the one to get him to leave office in this critical period before Biden takes over. But it's not clear that the 25th Amendment is really the mechanism that is supposed to do that.
To say this more bluntly, we have a very well lined out process in the Constitution called impeachment and removal, right. And that should be the preferred outcome, I would argue, over a 25th Amendment, which is not intended to be used as a way to remove a president who we don't like, who we think makes bad decisions. So it would make more sense to use the actual process described, written by the founders, as opposed to this sort of backdoor method. And it's like galling to see the preferred method to be, I know it's faster, but it would be much better for the country, I would argue, to have the members elected by the Congress. Most people don't know who is in Trump's cabinet. No one voted for them. So the idea that they should remove the president as opposed to the sitting Congress is not a good precedent.
But also this idea that the 25th Amendment is faster. Maybe it's a little bit faster just because of the slowness with which Congress moves. But what we saw last year with Trump's impeachment and trial that happened over a period of months, Congress doesn't have to do that. Congress sets its own rules. And if Congress wanted to, they could do this very quickly. So, this goes back to the point that Perry was making that, when you were asking about Galen, that's sort of like, what's the purpose of this delay? It's not like it's procedurally necessary. There's a political choice is being made to push this process along at the speed that it's happening. And there's an argument that's being made that the 25th Amendment is faster. That's a little disingenuous. Like, Pelosi could act faster if she wanted to.
Okay, so there are a couple different pieces here, which is why the Democrats are deciding to take the route that they're taking and what the timeline looks for that likely impeachment. It seems the vast majority of Democrats in the House at this point have signed on. And then also how Republicans are responding to impeachment itself, but also to the president's behavior more broadly beyond just the question of whether or not they will impeach and convict him. So it doesn't seem like Mike Pence is going to invoke the 25th Amendment. You've also made legal constitutional arguments for why that wouldn't make sense anyway. Beyond Mike Pence, how are Republicans reacting to the idea of impeachment and conviction?
Just to go to the 25th Amendment briefly, the cabinet members who might be inclined to vote to remove Trump, they're quitting instead. So Betsy DeVos and Elaine Chao quit last week. So that vote is even more purposeless now. I don't think Mike Pompeo or a bunch of other Trump loyalists are going to vote out the president. So let's start there. In terms of Congress, I think in terms of members who have said unequivocally they will vote for impeachment and removal of the president, I think we're talking about Adam Kinzinger, who's a House member from Illinois. House Republicans don't matter that much, but in terms of like who would actually vote for an impeachment in the House and join the Democrats, I think we're at a very small number of Republicans. In the Senate, it sounds like Pat Toomey, Ben Sasse, maybe Susan Collins, probably Mitt Romney. You probably need 17 or 18 Republican votes for removal. I think we're at 4 or 5 right now. So I don't think you have the numbers. Maybe a House vote moves this, but you're hearing two arguments from Republicans. The first one is basically sort of a logistics one that doesn't address the fact, which is that Trump is leaving office in 10 days anyway. We should just let him go out of office. He can't do anything that badly, which I disagree with. He can do a lot badly, but they're sort of arguing he can't do that much bad in the last 2 weeks or 10 days he has. The second argument, which I think is even less convincing, is that being made by sort of Marco Rubio and others, is that impeachment will be too divisive for the country. I mean, that seems absurd. Like, the insurrection that the president encouraged is a divisive act. Moving out the president would obviously be controversial, but it wouldn't be divisive if the Republicans all voted for it, which they can do. So they're sort of like saying division that they're causing means that we can't go forward. But in reality, even if I find these arguments to be fairly unconvincing and disingenuous, particularly the second one, the Republicans are not showing a lot of inclination to support the president's removal. There have been some polls of voters, and it looks like a quarter of Republican voters support removing the president, but not anywhere near a majority. And so you're probably seeing a little bit of the core activists who are probably reaching out to members of Congress. My assumption is are probably more inclined to be against Trump's removal than being for Trump's removal.
This is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem here that I don't know that we can answer on this podcast, but if Republicans...
One of the most important questions I think we have about this part of the world's history is, could the Republican Party have reined in, the official Republican Party, members of Congress, the establishment, have reined in Trump more if they had acted early, or does Trump control the base? And I think the answer to that is not really clear. It looks like from the polling that a big block of Republican voters are very uncomfortable with this. And I tend to think that group would grow to some extent if Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, Nikki Haley gave a joint statement saying this is unacceptable. I think that number could grow. But I do think there's probably a core Trump base that might be 40% of the Republican Party or so that would not go with them. So the answer is I'm not sure. I think that there is a core Trump base, but I don't think it's like the overwhelming majority of the Republican Party. I think it's a block, and I think a unified Republican statement from Thursday, where all Republican leaders on Thursday said Trump must go, would have moved Republican opinion, but those people didn't want to do that.
So beyond the question of impeachment itself, which relies on members of the House and senators, how are Republicans reacting? So not necessarily on whether or not he should be impeached, whether or not he should be convicted and removed. What are Republicans doing? I mean, this is like a huge event in American history. And if they're not encouraging the president to be removed from office, what are they saying?
Well, there was like the initial reaction from a lot of Republicans after the events of last week that was kind of like, call off your goons and stop these people from continuing with this insurrection, which President Trump then followed, and stop these people from continuing with this insurrection, which President Trump then followed, and stop these people from continuing with this insurrection, which President Trump then followed, and stop these people from continuing with this insurrection, which President Trump...
The second argument, which I think is even less convincing, is that being made by sort of Marco Rubio and others, is that controversial, but it wouldn't be divisive if the Republicans all voted for it, which they can do. So there's the second one. The Republicans are not showing a lot of inclination to support the president's removal. There have been some polls, a little bit of the core activists who are probably reaching out to members of Congress. My assumption is are probably more inclined to be against Trump's removal than being for Trump's removal.
This is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem here that I don't know that we can answer on this podcast, but if Republicans...
One of the most important questions I think we have about this part of the world's history is, could the Republican Party have reined in, the official Republican Party, members of Congress, the establishment, have reined in Trump more if they had acted early, or does Trump control the base? And I think the answer to that is not really clear. It looks like from the polling that a big block of Republican voters are very uncomfortable with this. And I tend to think that group would grow to some extent if Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, Nikki Haley gave a joint statement saying this is unacceptable. I think that number could grow. But I do think there's probably a core Trump base that might be 40% of the Republican Party or so that would not go with them. So the answer is I'm not sure. I think that there is a core Trump base, but I don't think it's like the overwhelming majority of the Republican Party. I think it's a block, and I think a unified Republican statement from Thursday, where all Republican leaders on Thursday said Trump must go, would have moved Republican opinion, but those people didn't want to do that.
So beyond the question of impeachment itself, which relies on members of the House and senators, how are Republicans reacting? So not necessarily on whether or not he should be impeached, whether or not he should be convicted and
up with a statement that started with, well, we all know the election was stolen, but you got to go home, which, like, obviously, like, if you are continuing to insist that the election was stolen and there are people who are rioting in the Capitol because of it, like, that's not going to help anything. So that was like a pretty predictable and extremely weak tea response. And then we've seen just sort of like, you know, a variety of actions that are condemning what happened, but saying, you know, we have to move on in the name of unity. And like, you know, look, it's really the Democrats who are pushing this divisiveness by trying to push for impeachment. And like, we really need to get to a point where the country can heal. And the way to do that is not by trying to insist on accountability for the president. And as Perry was saying, like, get him out of office in a time when he could still be quite dangerous.
Has there been a break with him? Like, have people disavowed Trump even if they're not calling for his removal?
I mean, I don't know what a break with him looks like right now if it's not supporting him no longer being in office. You have people like Betsy DeVos and Elaine Chao who resigned from the cabinet and they're like, okay, this is a bridge too far. I can't be in this cabinet anymore. But they have served under Trump for the past 4 years. You know, there have been plenty of things that have pointed to something like this happening, and Trump has done plenty of things that are not inciting an insurrection, but like leading to this point. And so, you know, to say like, oh, I can't serve in this administration anymore. Oh, this president has gone too far. This question of what a break looks like, I don't know what that is at this point, given that the choice is basically, do you let him stay in office for the remainder of his term? Or do you say, oh, you know, he can't really do that much damage. It's better for the country to just let him serve out his term and leave, and then Biden will take over and then we can move on from there.
So Nikki Haley said in the last few days, Trump's post-election actions will be, quote, judged harshly by history. I think that's what we're talking about here. Like, that's my sense, is the people who distance themselves with Trump will use his name and say Donald Trump did bad things in this post-election period. I'm guessing the Republican Party is not going to ever disavow his actions in the most of his first 4 years, but my sense is there will be Republicans who will say directly what Donald Trump said and did led to what happened in the Capitol. And then you'll get a lot of Republicans who will suggest there was a mob and some people were with Antifa and sort of other things that suggest what happened on Wednesday had nothing to do with Trump or very little. And I think that's the core difference that we're going to see. Disavowal of Trump is going to look like what Nikki Haley said. And I think you'll see a fair amount of people do that, even if they don't necessarily vote for removal. And then particularly outside, there are plenty of prominent Republicans outside of Congress who don't have a vote on this. And my guess is those people will also divide in those two camps of who blames Trump for Wednesday and who doesn't.
What has Mitch McConnell said?
His wife did resign from the cabinet, so I think he's sort of trying to hint that he's in both camps. I don't think he's directly said Wednesday was because of Donald Trump, but I think he's tried to play both sides of this, while some of his staffers have been hinting that Trump caused this. So I think it's like, does Mitch McConnell ever get to the point of disavowing Trump's, I think he might. He hasn't done so yet, is my impression. His comments have been more circumspect. He's not in the zone of like the Republicans who are not at all criticizing Donald Trump either.
And the other thing that I'd just add is that for Republicans, this debate over impeachment, like, it's not just about whether to remove Trump from office. Obviously, it could have the effect of doing that. But also there is this option as part of an impeachment trial that Congress can bar him from holding further federal office. And so obviously, we're like heading into uncharted territory here. Trump would be the first president to be impeached twice, much less to, see an impeachment trial potentially continue after he's no longer president. But that is another option, even if the trial happens and it doesn't finish or even start until Trump has left the White House. There is this other step that they can say, okay, he's not in the White House anymore, but he really needs to not be president again. He needs to not be able to run in 2024. And so I think Democrats are likely thinking about that and will try to, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more pushing on that.
So let's dig in a little bit to that timeline, because for Republicans who are saying, I condemn Trump's actions, but impeachment is divisive, part of their argument is that, well, he couldn't be removed from office before January 20th anyway, unless all 100 of the senators decided to begin the trial immediately as soon as they received the impeachment articles from the House. So that means one Republican says no, and it's therefore not possible to remove the president before the 20th. So how are Democrats thinking about this process given that conundrum? Are they going to try to fast track the articles of impeachment and pressure 100 senators to begin the trial immediately and I guess pretend that that is a possibility, withhold the articles of impeachment until Trump has left office, therefore maybe slightly acting counter to what they say their claim is, which is to remove the president as soon as possible? What happens here?
So the interesting thing is happening where there was a story in the Washington Post where people close to McConnell sort of floated the idea. Remember, McConnell is the majority leader and controls the Senate until January 20th, is my understanding, until Kamala Harris is sworn in. So McConnell's allies floated the idea that they couldn't, because of the Senate calendar and other things they could change if they wanted to, but they floated the idea that an impeachment trial could not start until January 19th. And therefore, an impeachment trial would therefore extend at least beyond that. And what they're hinting is, of course, that an impeachment trial, the Republicans are threatening essentially that an impeachment trial will go into the first 10 days to 2 weeks of the Biden administration. And now you're seeing Biden aides are sort of anonymously telling reporters, we're nervous about impeachment because we don't want impeachment to get away in the way of our first couple weeks as governing. So now you've got basically a situation where Republicans are hinting, if you're going to do this, we're going to have a real impeachment then. We're going to slow walk it as much as possible. Biden is therefore like, I don't want this getting in the way of my first couple weeks as president. So I think Clyburn has suggested that we should send the articles of impeachment up, but maybe like in March or something. This all seems a little bit convoluted because there's a lot of sort of like legislative gamesmanship being played here, because at the end of the day, nobody thinks that Trump's going to be removed. So everybody's trying to figure out what is the timing best for placating my individual political needs.
Is it possible, Amelia, to convict a president who's no longer in office?
Again, this is a bit of an open question because it hasn't happened. But the consensus that I've seen from the legal experts who study impeachment is, there's nothing really to say that the president can no longer be held accountable for impeachable offenses once he's no longer in the White House. And the fact that there are other mechanisms beyond removal for holding the president accountable suggests that, this is something that the president doesn't immediately get out of impeachment free card as soon as he vacates the White House.
I've seen some questions as to whether it would be possible for the Senate to bar President Trump from ever holding federal office again without actually convicting him. And that question has to do with the fact that you could bar him from holding public office based on a simple majority, so 51 votes, whereas conviction would actually take 66 or, 2/3 of the Senate. What kind of legal opinions have you seen on whether or not you could enact the repercussion without the conviction?
Basically, the consensus I've seen is that you do have to do the conviction vote first. And so that would need to happen even if Trump was no longer president. And then you could do the 51 vote barring from holding federal office. Obviously, from the Democrats' perspective, it'd be much easier to accomplish the goal of barring Trump from holding federal office if they only needed a simple majority. But there may be a little bit of diversity of legal opinion about this just because that is inevitably the case in these uncharted territory situations. But most of the legal experts, at least that I've talked to and I've seen write and report on this, seem to assume that it's 2/3 vote to convict. And then you can go down the path of, okay, should this person be barred from holding federal office?
So some of the polling I've seen on this, and of course, we've had 5 days for the public to digest what happened and tell pollsters what they think. But it's somewhere between 70 and 75% of registered voters opposed the storming of the Capitol, with around 60% saying that it's a threat to democracy and perpetrated by domestic terrorists. So there's pretty overwhelming condemnation, although not universal at all, condemnation of what happened. I've also seen polling that around 55% of Americans think that the president should be removed. So that gives us a little bit of the lay of the land. Is it a political liability for Republicans if they do not move to impeach the president, or I don't know what other options they have, but say it even happens after he leaves office, if they don't convict him either, does that become a political liability?
I don't think so. I tend to think that the next elections are almost 2 years from now. I assume Donald Trump will not be on the ballot in any election. Maybe one of his children will be, and maybe it's a problem for them. But voters have short memories. Most voters vote based on party. I'll be curious, even if you're in a swing state, does the Democrat running against the Republican even mention, you voted 3 times to keep Donald Trump in office, and you also voted to question the election results? I even wonder if that's an issue on the table in 2 years. I'm skeptical the Democrats will run on that. I'm skeptical it'll move many people. This is unpopular. Like, obviously, the insurrection at the Capitol was terrible, but I think linking that to Trump is what Democrats could do. I doubt they will, and I don't know how effective it'll be.
Interesting. This is unknowable. I am just surprised by how fleeting you see this being.
The event itself, obviously, I don't think is fleeting.
Political repercussions, of course.
Yeah, the political repercussions for individual Republicans, I'm skeptical, are very high.
It depends to a certain extent, too, right, on what happens next. I think there's this question of, are we going to see more violence around Inauguration Day? And then sort of like, what is Trump going to do when he's no longer president, but still, and has also like lost a lot of his platforms for reaching people, but still presumably holds pretty significant sway over his base. So I think for me, part of it is, what does Trump post-presidency look like? And how does he continue to activate these divisions that resulted in such horrifying violence last week? And that's kind of the big open question for me, and I would guess is something that Republicans are probably at least a little bit concerned about. Like, it is better for them if Trump is not out there inciting violence when he leaves the White House. If he just fades into the background quietly, knowing what we know about Trump, I certainly don't expect him to do that. So I think that's one of the big unknowns for me.
The other big unknown is Biden. It looks like Biden wants to get up on January 20th and basically say this part of our country's history was terrible and over, and we're like starting a new page. I get the sense Biden is not interested particularly in like really detailing what happened, describing it, exiling Republicans who supported this in any way out of public life. I think there's a demand on the Democratic side for looking at these last 4 years, looking at last week, and really punishing the people who perpetuated this, particularly Trump. But I don't think that is shared by Biden, who is the person who has the most power to influence public opinion, particularly among liberals and even among the rest of the country. If Biden is in this I want to move on period, that's going to have a big impact. And I think that's where he is right now, at least.
Also, to your earlier point about where Republicans stand and whether or not they'll face political repercussions, just so many Republicans, the majority of the House caucus, voted to overturn the results of elections in particular states that it seems like there's almost a suicide pact at this point, where if it was like a significantly smaller part of the party, then there could be some kind of movement to ostracize people. But state level parties, the RNC writ large, the House caucus, to a lesser degree, Republicans in the Senate, it was only 6 or 7 that voted to overturn the election. But there's so much inertia here that may well be part of the reason that they aren't held to account by the Republican Party itself. The question will be for some of these Republicans, whether they are Nikki Haley or whether they are Dan Crenshaw or people who want to pursue a future in the Republican Party, are also breaking with Trump to some extent, but not talking about conviction, removal, etc. What are they going to do about the fact that the base is still really excited about Trump? or at least excited about Trump's politics. And so what path do they take in the primaries? What argument do they make to the public? I'm certainly curious to watch how that unfolds. But we're getting to the point in every conversation we have that we don't know yet. We have to see what happens. This is to be determined. And so let's end this here and let's talk about why this happened. And to do that, we're going to bring on a couple more people into the discussion. But first, today's podcast is brought to you by Noom. Think about everything you've ever learned about getting healthy. There's a lot of contradictory information out there, and things like that old-fashioned food pyramid aren't much help. Enter Noom. Based in psychology, Noom teaches you why you make the choices you do and gives you the tools to replace your habits with healthier ones. Noom's cognitive behavioral approach means you're not just losing weight, you're building the habits you need to keep it off. Everyone is busy, and that's why Noom doesn't demand much of your time. They only ask for 10 minutes a day, and over 80% of Noomers finish the program, and over 60% have stuck with their goals for at least 1 year. Sign up for your trial today at Noom, Noom.com/politics. Learn how to eat again with Noom. Sign up for your trial today at Noom, Noom.com/politics. Again, sign up for Noom today at Noom.com/politics. Pro-Trump extremists' attempted insurrection at the U.S. Capitol resulted in at least 5 deaths, and according to reporting since Wednesday, seems to have come close to a significantly more dire situation. I'd encourage listeners to read the reporting from the Washington Post and the New York Times about what happened in real time from the people who experienced it. It really gives you a sense of the extent to which the security of the country's lawmakers and everyone in the building was on a razor's edge. So one of the big questions now is, how did we get here? So joining us for this segment, in addition to Perry and Amelia, is Kaylee Rogers, a politics and tech reporter here at 538. Hey, Kaylee.
Hey, how's it going?
Going well. Also joining us is Hakeem Jefferson. He's a political science professor at Stanford University, researching race and identity in American politics, and he's also a contributor to 538. Hi, Hakeem. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, y'all. Good to be here.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, the elements that led to the storming of the Capitol are numerous. There's Trump's specific incitement leading up to and on January 6th. There's encouragement from Trump and many Republicans to believe that the election was fraudulent. There's white nationalism, militia movements on and offline, a lack of preparation from law enforcement, and more. And of course, many of these things may overlap. So all of you have researched and reported on these different forces. And I want to hear from you all what your research and reporting tells us. So let's open things up with that fundamental question. Kaylee, let's start with you. You wrote an article for the site over the weekend that is titled, "Trump Helped Take Extremist Views from the Fringes of Society to a Mob Attacking the Capitol." So kick us off. Why did this happen?
In many ways, this was the culmination of years of online rhetoric that has been brewing and has been fueled by Trump in many ways. But among right-wing, far right-wing extremist groups online, there's been sort of this fantasy about taking back the country, about violent acts to take over Congress. And this has always been there in the rhetoric, but it's certainly reached a fever pitch over the last year due to the election, losing the election, Trump claiming that the loss was fraudulent and that the election was stolen. And then you add into all that the pandemic, which is a really big factor here that I think is sometimes overlooked. There was a lot of dissatisfaction with certain liberties being taken away due to lockdowns, which were necessary in order to try and curb the spread, but which many people opposed and felt like crossed a line. And people were out of work. They were spending more time online, getting more radicalized by these online conversations that were happening, and just feeling frightened and scared for the future, as many of us were during this pandemic. So all of that combines together, and then you get this invitation from the president to come to DC on this day. And depending on the groups online, some people thought they were going to see a big celebration where Pence or Trump was able to somehow overturn the results and reveal a big win for Trump, and they would have this great moment of glory. Other people were just frustrated with the results of the election and wanted to air that frustration, as we typically do in America. You know, this happened when Trump was elected as well. There were not my president rallies, and that's perfectly allowable. But what happened is all of this kind of brewed together to create this really intense moment that was really triggered by Trump and pushed by him, especially on the day of, literally telling people to go to the Capitol. And so it was kind of inevitable that with all those factors combined, something like this was going to happen.
Hakeem, let's turn to you. You wrote an article for the website that was up over the weekend titled "Storming the U.S. Capitol was about maintaining white power in America." So talk about some of the forces at play there.
Yeah, I think everything that Kayleigh said is exactly right. And it's just compounded by whiteness. That's the thrust of the argument I make in the piece, highlighting a lot of social science research over now many, many years that showcases the great lengths that white folks go to maintain racial power. And for listeners less familiar with this bit of literature, we're often interested nowadays in how are white folks responding to changing demographics in the country. And so I just want to highlight a couple pieces of scholarship that I shout out in the piece, starting with some work by Ashley Jardina, a professor at Duke University, who wrote in White Identity Politics. That's the title of the book. It's that simple, White Identity Politics. She notes that we're seeing this increasing salience of white identity. For a long time, for white folks, being white was like being a fish in water. Like, what the hell is water? It's where I spend all my time. It's the norm. But as we've seen these changing demographics, the browning of America, changing cultural shifts, etc., brought about by immigration, perhaps a move to the left in some domains, we've seen whiteness become a more salient feature of these white folks' identity. And the work that it culminates with the ascendance of Donald Trump, whom Ta-Nehisi Coates provocatively calls the first white president to the White House. And what we're seeing is that these white folks are responding to, we're seeing this backlash to what they perceive to be racial progress. On the one hand, changing demographics is highlighted by psychologists like Jen Richardson and Maureen Craig. We're seeing that white people, in the face of increasing precarity to their hold on power, taking great lengths, going to great lengths to maintain that power, or at least to showcase their frustration with the perceived loss of that power. And I think that's what we saw at the Capitol. And it's why we see a bunch of white folks and not a bunch of black or brown folks who, too, as Kayleigh has noted, have lived through a pandemic, have been frustrated by economic downfall and all that. But we don't see black and brown folks going out doing this sort of thing because all of this is compounded by whiteness.
I'm curious, what are the forces that come together in white communities or amongst particular white voters that make them form political preferences around their white identity versus other white voters who may not be as driven by white identity as a motivating political issue?
That's a really great question. And there's some great work by social psychologist Claire Wilkins, I believe, who showcases this perception of a kind of reverse discrimination, this belief that white folks have this broad disadvantage in society. And this might not make a lot of sense to those of us who look at the objective reality and we say, well, white people wield a great deal of power in all of these different spaces. But this is brought about by things like elite rhetoric. It's brought about by media outlets showcasing the browning of America. It's brought about by conversations at legacy outlets like The Times that highlights this loss of status and the sort of diner conversations with people highlighting how they've been left behind. It's this language of grievance and disadvantage that has so populated so much of the media discourse. It's been taken on by populists and faux populists who attempt to gin up or energize a base of supporters, right? This is in part elite driven. And so we have to attend to the kind of language that we hear from members of Congress or hosts on Fox News who sort of parrot this language of loss and status deprivation. And so it's a confluence of